Annyeonghaseyo. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present what TÜV Süd, and I'll get to that in a second, does in the area of industrial automation, Industry 4.0. But before we go there, I'd like to briefly give you an idea about the company. So just briefly about TÜV Süd, because I think it's not a brand known by everybody. It's a company more than 150 years old, and I'm always flippantly saying this is older than the state of Canada, which actually it is. It's a global company by the token that we have 43% of the revenues outside of Germany, and by today more than 50% of the revenue we produce actually is generated also outside of Germany, with Asia Pacific being the major growth area we have. And what TÜV Süd does, basically we test, certify, inspect everything between a teddy bear produced in China or a manufacturing plant or a refinery or a car plant in the USA or here in Korea. And the next slide you should recognize because it was presented before. We didn't coordinate this, but it's the same slide. So there seems to be a hidden source somewhere. But briefly put, in 1866, TÜV Süd was founded, and it was founded by industry, because the reason basically was in Germany, as the country of beer, a lot of brewing pressure vessels were exploding. And at that time there was a major accident in Mannheim. Industry leaders got together and said, we have to do something. Let's set up an organization which writes down and permeates best practices on how to operate plants safely, securely, and productively. And we basically went through all the 3 industrial revolutions and a few conflicts around it successfully, from the steam engine, where we did the beer brewery processing plants, to the second industrial revolution, where we basically had to adopt our product portfolio to how do we work with automation, with basically Taylorism in production, to the automobile, where actually TÜV Süd is one of the biggest testing bodies of cars in the homologation phase, but also in the operation phase, to today's challenge, which is cyber-physical systems or Industry 4.0, where the question is, how can we operate this complexity in a safe and secure fashion? So what we have done during the course of that work, we have been putting together a what we call a readiness and maturity index, where we visit companies, we work with them, basically to see how far they are in their Industry 4.0 journey. Not just in the realm of technology, but also in terms of processes, in terms of obviously technology, but also in terms of organization. Basically the goal is, after this exercise, to come up with 3 key areas for action, what a company could do to really kind of accelerate their journey to Industry 4.0, which you could question if it's an endpoint or journey. I think it's an endpoint, but basically gives you an idea of what to do differently next Monday. So we have worked with quite a few companies, mainly Singapore-based. That's where the index has been invented. But the key findings you see on the right-hand side here. So the first key finding is every company, small or large, if it's an SMB or a large one, is moving to the cloud and moving to software as a service, because it scales. It brings together expertise from various domains. So basically there's no way around it. The second thing is, which you already have seen before, is there is IT and OT convergence. The classical IT space where I come from and the factory automation, they do grow together. The challenge though is, de facto today there are 2 different organizations. You usually have a CIO who runs the enterprise IT, your laptops, your what have you, and you have a production automation engineering department which runs all the OT stuff. So how get these people together? They talk different languages, they have a different legacy, and very often they have different trainings. Nevertheless, if you look really at the IT infrastructure, the 2 systems already do interoperate. And then if you go really into the factory networks, what you see there is challenges in terms of visibility of the topology of the network, the patch history, the firmware versions, basically everything which your IT or your CIO does very well on your mobile device and your laptop, but still is a challenge, especially in organically grown factory environments. So this should be no surprise. I mean, everybody knows that cybersecurity is a big concern, and I'd only like to point out one very specific thing here. So since 2000, call it 10, 12, we have seen a new quality in the activities, in the attacks. Before that, and I have done this as a younger man in the 1990s, it basically have been single persons writing viruses on their, customized, specialized software to attack web addresses. So that's basically where phishing was invented. But around 2000, hacking became an industry. If you would like to run a business case on a ransomware attack, it's actually pretty easy. And the number you come across with, I didn't bring it because I might have issues with it. A ransomware attack usually should generate profits in the area of 20 to 30 million per attack. So there is a business model behind it. And a lot of, not just single people, but companies have been engaged in such endeavors. From 2012 onwards, and I think if you remember the Stuxnet issue, which was used, I don't know still exactly by whom exactly, but I would have a guess, was a advanced persistent threat to shut down the uranium depletion or production facilities in Iran. Was basically an industrial virus which was put onto a Siemens control system for that purpose. Everybody knows that, so it's no big surprise here. But what really happened, it did damage in the physical space. It really kind of shut down the centrifuges which were used to produce enriched uranium for nuclear weapon production. So since 2012, we do have industrial attacks on physical assets outside of the IT. We have nation states and big corporations engaging, and today I would say 10 to 15,000 new malware samples per hour. So the whole cyber attack industry has become exactly that, what it is. It has become an industry. Now, it's inconvenient if your hard drive is encrypted and you can't read it, but how does it really permeate into the physical space? So what we have have done a year ago, we decided to run a small experiment. So what we did, we simulated a public waterworks, a public water supply for a smaller city of, roughly speaking, 20,000 inhabitants. We built more or less the control system of such a waterworks, which is half physical, I mean the real controllers, which you see on the top here, and all the rest was basically simulated in a computer. Had it run for, I think, 8 months, and we generated more than 20,000 attacks. We simply put the whole thing on the internet, did nothing, and just waited what should happen. So it was interesting in the sense that the attacks, the 20,000 attacks, came from everywhere in the world. The major country the attacks supposedly came from was China, but do I really believe that? Not necessarily, because if you look at the little table here, you see the IP addresses, and if you then decode the host name, so what you'll find is very strange places, like the SANS Internet Storm Center, which is actually what's supposed to prevent exactly this. Or we even had an attack by the Polish parliament onto our waterworks, which is highly unlikely because they really have different things to do. So main point is attacks are global. You really don't know where they come from, but the main point basically is as soon as you're on the internet, if you're a plant, even an insignificant one, you will have somebody or some buddies trying to get into your system and change things. It hasn't been total beginners too. So out of the 20,000, actually 4 have been serious in the sense that they went beyond the standard internet protocols and really knew what to do in specialized industrial protocols. So they actually did read and write onto the controllers, not knowing exactly what they do, but we had different memory content after a while. So main point here, cybersecurity, as it was mentioned before, is a main thing in the industrial or in the OT space, and there's no way basically getting around it. In the meantime, and that's just a collection of recent newspaper clippings, the insurance industry has woken up. So you see Allianz, which is a big German, globally active insurance. They basically say that connected industry obviously is more likely to be attacked because the stake is higher. We do obviously have attacks onto cars, and just today it was released that BMW has been found to have a few issues in their current car software, which they're patching right now. The funny thing is, it was actually a Chinese company, Tencent, which wrote the report. So again, you see a global dimension and who does produce something and who does check if it's working. And obviously, we have attacks getting more sophisticated and professional, which shouldn't surprise you if you have looked at the slide before. So the big question is like, what can be done and how shall we deal with the whole thing? So I think the main point is we talk about convergence, we talk about the IT merging together with the OT, but in the past we had different responsibilities in the different departments. We had the classic IT responsibility, we had the CIO, who in his thinking was very network, and that's the industry I come from, and app-centric. So they look at the network if it's up and running, and they look at the apps they're running on the whole thing. But outside of maybe the financial services industry and the service providers, the big telcos, IT has not been the core business, but always been just the support of the business. So in a way, they have been there to keep the lights on and not be the strategic centerpiece of the business it is. What is very different if you look at IT in the manufacturing space. Also, if you look at the assets in the infrastructure, in the classic IT responsibility, they're usually more homogeneous. You do have your IP protocol, you do have your standard Microsoft, what have you, Azure maybe as the foundation of your operations, and that's something which is very different in the production space. In the production space, you actually have the COO or the plant manager being responsible for whatever is on his location in his plant, and very often you have actually different plants with different release and patch status. You have different people buying different things because they say it's my plant, so I have to optimize it. So you have a much more spread out architecture or basically build state behind it. The PLCs and the processes are the mainstay of the company, so no experiments please, or never change or never fiddle around with a running system to try something. Actually, and that's just a story on the side, when we did penetration testing from TÜV Süd, which is what we provide, one guy shut down a manufacturing line because he was kind of basically attacking the IT, but ended up in the OT, so we had a bit of an issue. So these are things you do not want to happen, but that's something where you have a different mentality in the IT space and the OT space. And obviously, and that shouldn't be a surprise for you, production is mission critical, and rebooting is not an option. The whole thing has to run full stop, no matter what. But if you look at the infrastructure behind it, it's really much more fragmented. It's multi-domain, you have different protocols. It's often proprietary. A lot of software has been written specifically on legacy assets. So how to get them patched and how to make them secure is a challenge, which ties back into the point I was trying to make around visibility. So this is just to scare you a little bit. This is a classic IT, OT, converged cybersecurity model. We do have the classic IT space there on the top. We have the enterprise network. We have everything good IT people do around cloud-based threat protection. We can enforce policy across the whole network, which is what is done. Also, there is access control on the application level, i.e. if you sign on your whatever software you need, you get access control, who can use what. On the bottom level, on the cell, under the area zone, this is the classic manufacturing domain. You, in the old days, had more or less a standalone installation, but now you're starting, and that's what also Schneider does, to think through basically policy enforcing devices like intrusion protection system. They have to be ruggedized because they live on the plant floor, so it's not something you can buy in your local, call it Cisco or electronics store. They have different operating parameters, so it's something which needs a bit of experience in the domain, otherwise it won't work. And of course, and we've seen this in the videos, you have to have the ability to remote monitor and survey what's going on and to configure which asset is running which software, which is something in a lot of manufacturing installation have seen is not working flawlessly. So every architecture which manages to build the bridge from the enterprise into the cell, the manufacturing zone, has to have these traits to make the whole solution stack secure. In the middle, I'm not going to go into a lot of details for that. You, of course, do have a demilitarized zone where you separate what needs to be separate in terms of traffic. And you basically optimize the interlinkage between different cells in the manufacturing zone where there's another added level of security. I think this is something which we see in the protocols or in the offers we have seen at Schneider. So you do have an integrated from top to bottom model here. But that's only the technical view. I think the technical view is relatively easy because everybody can draw an architecture diagram and say your product has to do this and this and this and this. I think the real challenge is in that space. We have been talking quite a bit on cybersecurity. That was all I have been talking about the last 10 to 15 minutes. And if you look through the different aspects you have to embrace, it's not just the technology, there's also people, the processes, obviously the networks, and the things you connect. But the main component, the main vector of attacks we have seen in the past, 70% of the attacks actually have come from people, from insiders, especially those that shut down large manufacturing plants. Very often it has been people that knew exactly what they have been doing. So the insiders with privileged access, they are usually the weakest link in such installations. The enterprise and industrial IT need to be viewed jointly. That's also a people question. We have different people with different goals, different interests. So the CIO and the COO have to work together. There is a culture problem. They're used to different languages. Maybe sometimes they even have different incentive schemes. And that takes a while to kind of really make sure that these people do understand each other, which I think we now achieve because we have IP as a common language. A lot of people have changed, and I think Diego did too, have changed their department. So from IT to OT. So I come from the OT space. I went into IT. So there's a lot of things that are going that direction. And then that's something where we, as TÜV Süd, because that's our business, we get asked quite a bit. So there's these certificates like ISO 27001, which really deals mainly with security in software development, or ISC 62443, which does that, or ISO 27001, which deals with management processes in software security. So if you do have the certificate, that's great, and it's something which we see with a lot of companies, actually, that they demand their suppliers to have these certifications, otherwise you can't use their product. That can only be the basis to build cybersecurity upon. So if you take 27001, basically the only thing it does an assessment about your cybersecurity management processes. That doesn't mean you actually did patch your firewalls. It doesn't mean you have visibility of the topology of your plant network. It doesn't mean you bought the right product. It only basically gives you an indication that the processes you have are made you could do these things. A second thing is, which is very important in the respect, and let me use the example of a car, but it also applies to the industry space. You need to go from a periodic to a continuous test and inspection cycle. So in the old days, you could basically rely that if you buy a car, it doesn't change after it has basically left the plant. Today, you do software updates, even over the air, as Tesla does and Daimler is going to do, which change not just the entertainment system of your car, but it also does change the functional behavior of your car, how it interacts with the environment. I mean, one example is Elon Musk gave his Tesla customers an extra 2 kilometers per hour top speed for Christmas. And he extended the range for hurricane victims by whatever it was, I think 20, 30 kilometers, by just changing the battery management software. Now, if you do that too often, the question is, can you still trust your brakes? So there is a linkage between what you do in terms of updating your product and how it interacts with the physical environment. So we have to go from certify a product once and be happy with it to continuously see if we still are safe to operate something, which applies again for cars as well as for industrial control systems. Next point, fast reaction in case of incident. As we've seen with the waterworks example, you can safely assume that as soon as you're connected to the internet, there will be attacks, and you just have to wait long enough until there is success somewhere in shutting down something. So there is no perfect safety and security. So you have to prepare for the case that something goes wrong and have the organization, the processes in the technology as well as in the organization space to make sure you actually can defend yourself if something goes wrong. That's updates, that's backups, that's forensics. So there has to be a capability to deal with these things. That brings me to the last point, and me being German, and I come from an area in Germany where there's lots of small and medium-sized business in Schwaben. Yeah, so the typical company there has maybe 500 employees, and their IT is done by the son of the founder who happened to study information technology. They usually do not have the bench strength to really run all what we have seen before. So there is the need, and I think companies that have not just a product but a service offering around it, there is a need for these companies to help mid-sized companies, which are actually responsible for most of the economic growth in Germany, to achieve IoT, OT convergence and deliver services to make their IT, OT infrastructure safe and secure. Now that was the cybersecurity space, but let's now go to the functional safety. Functional safety, i.e. how a product interacts with its physical environment, is at least as important as the cybersecurity. And as with the car example, we already talked about software as a critical element in the functional safety of a product. I would say software is as critical as safety valves or airbags or sprinklers or whatever. Just think about the example of an elevator which is controlled by software. And there's, basically the software decides where the elevator stops when it closes its doors. Software needs to be checked as thoroughly as anything else in the whole functional safety value chain. And to be able to do this, you really have to look at the whole system, as we've seen before with the IT-OT convergence, the software, but also the hardware the software is running on. I just remind you of the little hiccup with the Android operating system when there was a new Wi-Fi chip introduced, so the hardware actually exposed a security gap in the software, but just by changing a release. So there was something, never think the software is safe because you tested it without the hardware component. It always has to be the whole thing you're looking at. And then you have to think through the quality control along the whole value chain. I mean, software is not a thing that's running on one product only. It really runs on different ones, and sometimes it stays there for 10, 20, 30 years, especially in the manufacturing field. Big challenge, and to be very honest, I do not have an answer here, especially in the auto space where TÜV does a lot of work. There's a lot of open source use. So how do we actually certify and test open source when everybody can take it? And how can you make sure that it actually kind of does what it's supposed to do if it's changing consistently? That's something where the jury is still out. And what we have to also embrace is waiting for standards is probably not the right thing. It has to be learning by doing, by really testing it, because standards in that space are too long-termed until they get created and basically then approved. So the cycle, the innovation cycle in the IT industry is 18 months roughly from product to product, and end of life after 5 years. But with standards, we usually sometimes think 5 to 10 years is the innovation cycle. You see that we're lacking with the standards as opposed to the progress of innovation. Last but not least, I personally do think the time of deterministic testing is over. You have to simulate your environment. You have to do a fair bit of, this is my setup, how does it behave in the hardware software environment I have? That gives you a certain approximation of safety and security, but that will never be the 100% as you may have thought there will be in the past. Last but not least, that there might be a very German point of view of seeing it, privacy and confidentiality is a big and upcoming topic. In Europe, the GDPR, a data privacy regulation, has just been introduced and actually enacted Friday last week, which threatens a company which allows private information to leak with a fine of up to 4% of the revenues and a minimum of 20 million euros if certain privacy regulations are not observed. So the regulators have embraced that data is an economic good. It is the equivalent of money, and now they're starting to protect it. And as all the economic goods, as money, data can also be disappropriated. And the thinking goes towards a safe and secure platform independently of who's operating it. Can be a government agency, can be a company, who really make sure that all the data, the money, the virtual money that is exchanged is exchanged in a very trustful way. So the whole cloud, as Diego said, which has only one vector of attack and is usually managed by professionals, will apply to your most valuable asset, which is basically the data. I'll leave you with that, recognizing I've got another 20 seconds or so, but just one thing to give an idea what we at Track4 do to support the holistic approach I've been trying to put forward. We are covering I call it a bouquet of different services, from the IT management process certifications I've briefly talked about as the foundation of making security in the plant environment happening. We do cover also payment security, which from my perspective is actually very interesting because the payment security process is a very good template for rolling out software patches, also in industrial controllers, also to cars. So there's a certain best practice process changing. We have obviously certificates for certifying the IT infrastructure, i.e. if your data center is secure, is insurable, has access control, and all these things which are necessary to safeguard your data. And just briefly, a few months ago, we actually also entered into the market of secure cloud solutions, where we bought a tech company that enables to securely process, not just store, but securely process data with, at the same time, excluding the operator of the data center to ever see the decrypted state of the data the customer is sharing. With that, I'd like to close up, and if there's questions, I think in the coffee break there's time to talk about it. Kamsahamnida.